Over NBC's coast-to-coast network of independent and affiliated stations, the University of Chicago Roundtable. Be sure to listen for a special announcement at the close of today's program explaining how you can participate in NBC's University of the Air by joining Roundtable home study courses. And now we present Quincy Wright of the Department of Political Science of the University of Chicago. Mr. Wright.
We are discussing today the proposal which has been negotiated by the Department of State over the last few months that a North Atlantic Pact be established, which would bring together the United States, Canada, and the Western European nations into a common alliance for defense. Joining me in this discussion on the North Atlantic Pact and Russia are Herman Feiner, political scientist, and Louis Wirth, sociologist, both of the University of Chicago. Feiner, what do you think of the pact?
Well, in my reluctant opinion, the pact is indispensable to deter the Soviet rulers from a revolutionary course. Either through exultance with power or frightened at its possible loss, I think they're moving along towards a possible state of war, and it is essential that they be sobered. Perhaps we may, in this method, be able to bring them to a more conciliatory state of mind. We must not repeat the experience we had with Hitler, who said, while the going was good, I move forward with the assurance of a sleepwalker. That ended in war.
Wirth, do you agree with that appraisal?
I do not. Of course, I have not seen the pact, or the text of it, or a draft of it, except as our newspapers have released excerpts from it. But insofar as the information has been revealed to us, the pact looks to me as a coalition which the Russians are bound to regard as directed against them. It will increase rather than decrease tension. It will make the Cold War hotter, and it means that the United Nations as an instrument to preserve peace is dead.
Well, let's spend a moment on just what this pact is. In the first place, it's exclusive. There's only going to be a limited number of states invited, and it isn't quite clear just who those states are going to be.
Now, on the question of exclusiveness, before we go into that, I may say that the 8,000-word Russian statement against the pact gave the impression that had it been open to everybody, there would have been no objection from their side.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that it's going to include the 5 European countries that are now joined in the Brussels Pact, that is United States, Great Britain, France, and the 3 low countries. It also will include the United States and Canada. There have been active negotiations in regard to the Scandinavian countries, and apparently Norway and Denmark are going to join. There has been mention of Ireland, Iceland, and Portugal, but their position is not clear.
And there has also been mentioned Italy, and possibly even at a later stage there may be mentioned Spain.
Yeah,
and surely
this
is not an Atlantic community.
Yeah.
It isn't a community of any kind.
Well, Italy has been mentioned, but the question of maybe Spain may be mentioned at a later stage, of course, is only so far within the realm of our speculations. On Italy, it's a very interesting point to notice, since we all work on the basis of the relationship between the Soviet and other countries, that Saragat, the right socialist, has jeopardized the Gasperi government by saying that if this pact should be contemplated by the Italian government, they might move over with the communists in opposition to it.
Well, Italy is certainly a little distance from the Atlantic Ocean. I'm not quite certain now that I agree with Wirth on the question of there being no North Atlantic community. That has been a much-discussed question.
I merely say that these states, if you take the collection of them, certainly do not represent a community.
Oh, well, that's an interesting point, which we hadn't considered before. I rather think that community, in Walter Lippmann's sense, in his book on American war aims, is a community of certain points of view in regard to religion, civil liberties, democracy, and things of that kind. I don't think that's to be omitted.
Perhaps the more important question is what obligations are going to be imposed and how is this pact going to work? As I understand, the basic principle is to be that a war against one is going to be a war against all. But do you have more detailed information on just what the obligations are going to be?
We have the heart of the pact from Mr. James Reston's article in the New York Times of February 28th, which he showed to Senators Connolly and Vandenberg, and which they agreed to, apparently. And it reads, if an armed attack should occur, the signatories would assist each other in such ways, also if necessary with armed force, as would seem desirable to defend the North Atlantic community.
I think the 2 points to be made on this, with that wording, are first, that each country would decide for itself whether the occasion had arisen for taking action. And secondly, that each party would decide for itself just what measures were required. For example, the United States might decide that circumstances required it to use armed force. Again, it might decide that the circumstances only required economic aid.
The debate in the United States Senate of February 14th, however, showed that all of the senators, even those favoring the pact, were not ready to commit the United States to an automatic warlike set of steps.
Yes, but the only question that really arises is this, I think, the main point on this. No signatory to any treaty can be, or ever has been, absolutely certain that when the time came, he would receive what was promised him. And international diplomacy is an exercise in promises and the tenability of promises. Now the question is the degree of probability that your friends who've signed the pact with you, is that degree of probability high? Does it give you enough assurance in your own free acceptance of such a pact?
Of course, there's another side to that shield, Feiner. If it's absolutely certain, then you may find yourself dragged into a war which you didn't want to go into. For example, it might be that the United States would become aggressive and get into war, in which case Great Britain and France and other countries, if they lived up to their obligation, would find themselves dragged into a war which they didn't want. Then, of course, there's the other circumstance that the Soviet Union might begin a nuisance policy of pinpricking Norway, and Norway would think that it's been the victim of aggression, but the United States doesn't think it's sufficient to justify action, and so we wouldn't go in, and Norway would accuse us of a breach of faith.
Yeah, but international alliances are never sure bets.
No, they're never sure bets, but what happens? Since somebody's going to call the tune and you're going to pay the piper, you'll be quite certain to bring the other man into the concert hall where you can keep an eye on what kind of tunes he's going to call. And this means, in these terms, that there will be some standing council and a common foreign policy.
I don't think we want to go into the constitutional issues, which the Congress has debated some. I'd merely like to observe that any such agreement as this has to be placed in the hands of some national authority, decisions. And the issue is whether Congress is to make the decision whether we should act in a particular circumstance or whether the President will do this. Now, constitutionally, there, I think, is no doubt but that the President, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy and responsible for the defense of the United States, can use the forces for defense. And he decides whether defense is necessary.
But as you may recall from the destroyer deal in Mr. Roosevelt's case, he's got to have public opinion behind him, and that may take a long, long time, as it did then.
Sure. On the other hand, it may take a short time. We can't argue against the pact because the public opinion may be more or less apathetic.
But just as in the case of the United Nations Charter, our Senate would probably never have consented to it if it hadn't contained the veto clause. So in this case, we're going to preserve a great deal of latitude to the senators to say yes or no to any military measures that are proposed.
Well, I would regard that as proper.
The Senate may have gained some education in the use of a veto in the last couple of years, and in any case, under this pact, I think it's clear that the United States does have the veto. But why is this pact being proposed at just this time? I suppose that the Soviet coup in Czechoslovakia had a lot to do with increasing the worry of Western Europe about the possibilities of Soviet aggression.
Yes. In the State Department statement of January the 14th, to which the Soviet government took exception, you have a clear line of events going down from the Czechoslovakian coup through Vandenberg resolution in June regarding worldwide assistance and so forth onto this, which is a kind of implementation in a way of the fears entertained after the coup in Czechoslovakia.
And isn't it also true that there's a feeling that in proportion as the Marshall Plan is successful and the prospects of Soviet winning over Western Europe by propaganda become less, that the dangers of Soviet military invasion of Western Europe become greater?
Of course, there are some assumptions contained in that statement, right? For one thing, we're not so sure as yet that the Marshall Plan has succeeded in doing what we wanted it to do, at least not as of to date. But there is, I would agree, in general, the assumption that underlies all of this talk about a pact, that Russia will try to take over Europe, And the Russians, on the other hand, are trying to create the counter-impression that we're trying to take over Europe. And that is the situation as we find it.
There's no doubt of that. But just how will Russia react? Will Russia, in case the pact goes into effect, we're not quite certain of that. The State Department is making it a major matter of policy, and the negotiations apparently have achieved near completion, but of course it has to be approved by the Senate, so we can't be quite sure this pact is going to be made, although the probabilities seem quite great that it will. Assuming that it does go into effect, how will Russia react? Would it mean that Russia would mobilize her resources more actively than she has?
Well, right on that, my position would be this. We have to try to discover the state of mind of the Soviet rulers. All our diplomacy and all our politics, if it's based upon persuasion rather than force, involves us in that. And what do we see? We see that by a long list of actual deeds which are available for everybody to notice, and a great deal of even boastful comments made in the Cominform manifesto and otherwise, that either for defensive or for expansive purposes, the Soviet Union is a very, very dynamic element, and it would seem that they never are going to stop, excepting where they are stopped by some external
But what
force.
you're saying, Feiner, doesn't mean that this would not increase tensions.
I don't deny that. But I think, if I may for a moment apply some psychiatry to the matter, that maybe a general increase in tension for some time might be very good because it throws people back on questioning their own situation and motives.
Right, I'm not a psychiatrist like Feiner is, but Stalin, it seems to me, already knows that if he makes a move that is aggressive, we will be against him, we will interfere, we will try to get as many allies as we can. Will it do very much to alter his state of mind if we send him a special delivery airmail registered letter to that effect? I do not believe it will. Moreover, I think it will tighten the lines. I do think it'll do that. And it will lead to certain countermeasures, such as they can take on the part of the Russians, who are in many respects a nuisance and an irritant to all of us, that may, or perhaps has already resulted to some extent in preparations for taking over such a country as Finland.
Well, right, in answer to that. It's true that I may have claimed to have the authority of a psychiatrist, but I'm not an authority on postal deliveries, as Worth seems to be. And we're not considering special delivery letters. To use a metaphor of that kind in a grave situation of this kind doesn't seem to be worthwhile. What you're delivering is not a special delivery letter. It's delivering the possibility of a coalition of armed defense on the part of some 7 or 8 nations. And if that doesn't deter the Soviet from things which are unreasonable and wrongful, I would like to know what will.
You're doing nothing of the kind. You're merely entering negotiations to get such a coalition. You're not sure yet whether we're going to get it. And even if we did get it, we don't know how powerful it will be.
We're assuming that the pact is going to effect and asking what Russia's reaction will be. I think it would be more than a special delivery letter. I think that the conclusion of this would give a kind of assurance to Stalin that the United States will take action in case of aggression, which Hitler never had. It may be that if we had long before, 1934 or 5, given definite assurances that the United States would take military action if Hitler expanded, that whole history would have been different. So I think there's value in such a thing as this.
I agree with you that in the long run, if nothing else happened to offset the tensions, that might be the effect. But in the meantime, you are going to have increased vulnerability on the part of those countries in Europe that are exposed to potential Russian attack, which we will not be able to help him in very much in the meantime.
I think that is open to question. Whether the other countries are vulnerable or not depends upon the readiness of the Soviet to take some drastic action against them. And that, I think, depends upon whether the pact itself is the answer to our other question, whether it's liable to sober up the people in the Kremlin, and secondly, whether they're in an economic position to undertake adventures at the present moment.
In general, you don't sober up people when you put them into a state of hysteria and crisis.
Well,
that's not the conditions under which people are sobered up.
But I'm not talking about in general. I'm talking about specifically, and I'm talking about the Politburo. That's the difference. And I will make this concession to you, seeing that I'm a psychiatrical man, and the concession is this. that all this is an exercise in probability. I will not be as more dogmatic than you happen to be on this subject. It is an exercise in probability, and I confess it. And now, if we don't act on probabilities, how can we do anything at all?
Well, I understand, Finer, your position is that it may increase tensions, but it will make the Soviets more willing to negotiate and perhaps have a general relief of tensions.
That is what I think, and it is certainly what I very, very much hope.
I see nothing of the sort. I do think there is a point to be made that if we are looking upon this pact as a bargaining point that we want to put into the pocket of Mr. Truman or Mr. Atchison when they come to negotiate with the Russians, it may actually be an important thing for that. But that is its principle, and if not its only importance that I can see.
You suggested a little while ago, Worth, that it would immediately increase the vulnerability of the European states. I think that would only be true unless we immediately add to the moral force which arises through the general signature of the Pact, military lend-lease or other military resources to our allies in Europe. And I presume that would be the case. If we did that rapidly, I can't see how their immediate vulnerability would be increased.
But, right, we've got to recognize the facts of geography. The Russians are at their doorstep, particularly the Scandinavian countries. They're next-door neighbors to the Norwegians.
They are now.
They have all kinds of privileges in Finland. If they were to take over Finland tomorrow and put it entirely under their control, they certainly would make these Norwegian and Danish and Swedish countries look very much more vulnerable. Moreover, this pact is going to divide the Scandinavian countries. It is not so sure that the Swedes will go in. It certainly is not even sure that the others will go in.
Well, they were not united to begin with, so how could they be divided?
But
take this question of their border.
The Swedes offered them a Scandinavian pact.
Yeah, but the Norwegians, after consideration, didn't think it gave them adequate protection. Take this question of a border. The Soviet didn't have a border with Norway before 1944. They deliberately took the border. Now they use that as an excuse. Remember that you're on our borders, so you go one further. And that isn't the only thing. They offered a non-aggression pact to Norway. Norway replied that they wouldn't have that, and furthermore that they wouldn't have bases unless there were attacks on them or threats of attack. Now, to which the Soviet Union replies, threats of attack. Anyone can make up a farrago of nonsense about what is a threat, so that you get to a point, and this is the principal thing that concerns me with this pact, you get to a point where even the words are turned and twisted, where promises cannot be accepted. Certainly the non-aggression pacts for the Baltic countries are no real model for Norway.
You'd have to agree that if, as Worth suggests, the Soviets took over Finland, that would be a threat of attack upon Norway. And I think that would be, the Norwegians would construe it that way and permit the United States to establish bases in Norwegian territory at that moment.
Well, since there's a buffer there, the person who gets over the buffer is surely responsible.
But the Russians would not merely be inclined to do that. Is it not to be expected that they will take every possible countermeasure that they can? For instance, we already see signs that they are strengthening what might turn out to be their fifth columns in the various countries of Western Europe, as the statements of the so-called Communist Party leaders and Rail Party leaders has already indicated.
Sure, that's true.
Would it not also mean the stopping of East-West trade, such as is left, which would certainly not be to the advantage of either the Soviet or the Western countries, and make them poorer?
It might have that effect. I'd like to ask, though, whether it would tend to increase the movement toward the United States of Western Europe. It may be that this sharpening of the lines would tend to bring the Western European nations closer together, so that they would form a common bloc to assist the Atlantic.
On the other hand, it might merely lead them to a competitive race with one another for dominance and for getting as much as they can out of the United States.
Well,
and a pact like this can be used easily for that purpose. It's a form of blackmail.
Well, I hardly think so. These people are suffering a common fate through their geographic situation. They're all weak. Don't you remember Belgian Premier Sparks' remarks at the opening of the last assembly, saying, we're a very small country, we threaten nobody. By whom are we threatened? I think that this is much more likely to supplement the economic and cultural arrangements and get somewhere much nearer to a Western Union than we've ever expected it to be possible.
A military alliance, especially if fostered by outside countries like the United States and Canada, is certainly not going to integrate Europe as Europe. I think more of the Brussels Pact along that line.
We'll spend just a moment on Asia. That we've discussed the effect in Europe. I think that the most serious aspect of the Pact, the one which worries me the most, is that it will greatly reduce the prestige of the United States in Asia. That the Asiatics, and I think this was indicated by Nehru's recent conference, will think that having made these special guarantees of Europe, we're no longer interested in the security of Asia, and that furthermore, we've linked ourselves with the European powers that have imperial possessions in Asia, and that therefore we're likely to become a supporter of Asiatic imperialism ourselves.
Yeah, well, speculating on that, the most extraordinary thing is what the Soviet believes about these, the unity of the Delhi Conference powers. They believe that they are actually one more move in the United States policy of world domination. They say that actually in their protest against the North Atlantic Pact. And I quote, they say it is clear that the servile attitude alone of certain leading persons in the governments of these countries will not suffice for the peoples of Asia to consent to embark on the slippery track. They regard that as a hostile action, not as one that actually detaches them from the West.
I hope that Stalin's interpretation of that conference is correct. I'm afraid it isn't. I'm afraid that it means that Nehru and the Asiatics are moving away from us and not toward us, as Stalin.
Yes.
But doesn't it mean fundamentally that the suspicions between Russia and the United States as the representative of the two great coalitions in the world has grown so great that anything that one side does is going to be viewed with suspicion and skepticism and fear by the other side?
I think the answer is yes.
That we've destroyed the climate in which we can really negotiate.
This raises the question of the effect of this pact upon the United Nations. We committed ourselves in the United Nations to the theory that war and also peace are indivisible, that the world is one, and that consequently if you're going to have any security arrangement, they've got to be universal. Now, it's been suggested that this conflicts with the United Nations.
I not merely think it conflicts, I think it is the funeral of the United Nations.
Well, I don't think it's the funeral, because I think the United Nations itself was stillborn and deliberately stillborn as a result of the will of the great powers. And in great powers, I would attach to them the little powers too.
Well,
whose main objection to the veto is not that the great powers have got it, but that they haven't got it.
Well, I disagree from both of you. I don't think the United Nations was stillborn. I think that it's a pretty weak child, and it hasn't gained strength too rapidly. I don't think that the Pact, the Atlantic Pact, would be the funeral of the United Nations. I think the United Nations will carry on. But I do think it's important to strengthen the United Nations if we make the Pact. Now, I don't think there's any legal violation of the United Nations Charter in making this agreement. I think it comes under Article 51 of the Charter. But I think that the implications that flow from it may be disturbing to the principles of the United Nations.
The statements that we have had from the Danes and the Norwegians certainly seem to indicate that they have no confidence in the United Nations to protect them and give them security. And that is why they're turning to this. But when you talk about regional agreements under the United Nations Article 51, surely this can't come under that. Because when you split the world into two belligerent camps, on the one hand, the United States, on the other hand, Russia, you're no longer talking about regional agreements under the UN.
Well,
that is something entirely outside of the UN.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Louis partly and disagree with him. First of all, the question of regional arrangements doesn't come under Article 51. Article 51 is concerned with an armed attack on your territory. And there I have to agree with Louis, but disagree a little from Quincy, who thinks it is legal under the United Nations Charter.
Regional arrangements are pretty vague. We have to remember that they added a clause to Article 53 that permitted the alliance between Great Britain and Russia to be characterized as a regional arrangement.
What worries me, sir, about the United Nations is this, that the Soviet authorities believe that the idea of world government is, and I quote, the idea of bourgeois intellectual cranks being used ideologically to disarm people from defending their nations against United States imperialism.
The Soviets have certainly made it clear that they don't believe in world government. They don't want a nullification of nationalism.
But on
That's
the other
reason
hand,
they're not collaborating too well with the United Nations. But we do believe in the United Nations, I think. That's the American ideal, and I think that we can, if the Atlantic Pact goes into force, as I think it probably will, I think we can, along with it, strengthen the United Nations. And I think we ought to seek to do that.
But, henceforth, if this pact is effective, the United Nations discussions will be mere ceremonial exercises, because everybody will know that the really important issues will be settled in the councils of the Atlantic Pact.
Well, that depends.
And this pact is not an instrument of settlement. It is a coalition under power politics. And if you're going to have an end to power politics, then it seems to me we must create an international authority, and the time to do this is now.
I question the word henceforth.
That the North Atlantic Pact is an old-fashioned military alliance which fits into a world of power politics rather than into a world of law. We recognize that Western Europe feels insecure and that the success of the Marshall Plan depends upon development of a greater sense of security in that area. But we differ as to whether the North Atlantic Pact is the best method to meet this need. It will permit cooperative planning for the defense of Europe and will convince potential aggressors in Europe that they will face the United States. But it may sharpen the line at the Iron Curtain, increase tensions, and accelerate the arms race. It may also impair American leadership in Asia and weaken the United Nations. I think the difficulties might be avoided if at the same time, a more general agreement were made, open to all members of the United Nations, providing for a common front against aggression anywhere by a procedure within the United Nations which is veto-less.
Thank you, gentlemen. You've been listening to the University of Chicago Roundtable discuss the Atlantic Pact and Russia, with Herman Feiner and Quincy Wright, both of the Department of Political Science, and Louis Wirth of the Department of Sociology, all of the University of Chicago, as participants. This week's Roundtable pamphlet includes the full text of today's discussion, reading lists, special charts and illustrations, and questions for analysis and discussion. You will want to receive this pamphlet and to study the supplementary materials on American foreign policy. Because of the quantity of additional features in the pamphlet, please allow 2.5 weeks for printing and mailing. Be sure to write for your copy and send 10 cents in coin with your order to the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois. For $3, you may subscribe to the pamphlet for a full year and receive 52 weekly issues. I'll repeat the address, the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois. Next week, the Roundtable will discuss guilt by association. And now, a special announcement.
Is the North Atlantic Pact another step in the U.S. policy of containment of Soviet Russia? Do you know what the containment policy is? How did the Cold War begin? Why did the United Nations not bring a world community? You can learn more about these questions through the University of Chicago Roundtable Home Study course in World Politics, which is a presentation of NBC's University of the Air. This course gives you a library of books and pamphlets, political materials, so that you may complete the course in your own home. Write your local station or the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois, for the leaflet describing the course World Politics. It is open to all, and you may begin at any time. Write today.
Today's Roundtable originated in the Mitchell Tower studios of the University of Chicago. This is NBC, the national broadcasting company.